Japanese soldiers fighting across the Pacific were sustained by rations that reflected not only the limits of Japan's economy, but also the ideology of sacrifice that shaped its military culture. The Imperial Japanese Army built its feeding system almost entirely around rice. Rice was seen as the essential fuel of the soldier, both nutritionally and symbolically. A daily portion could reach up to a kilogram of white rice in theory, but in practice, wartime shortages and the breakdown of supply lines meant that frontline soldiers often received only a fraction of that amount. The rice was frequently mixed with barley or millet to stretch the supply, and when even those substitutes ran short, men were issued half-rotten rice, insect-infested grain, or starchy roots scavenged from local sources. This monotony was broken only rarely with dried fish, pickled radish, or a spoonful of miso paste. Fresh vegetables were almost non-existent in forward positions, and fruit was a luxury a soldier might not see for months. The lack of balance in the diet produced predictable health crises. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, became widespread, leaving men with weakness, numbness, and swollen limbs. Scurvy, diarrhea, and dysentery were common, especially in tropical island campaigns where clean water and fresh supplies could not be guaranteed. A soldier could be expected to march, fight, and labor under conditions of permanent caloric deficit, his body burning muscle to keep up with the demands of combat. The Imperial Command treated hunger as another test of endurance. Training manuals stressed that soldiers must never complain about food, and officers often reinforced this by taking equal or smaller portions themselves to set an example. The Japanese soldier was told that spiritual strength could compensate for physical weakness, that victory would come through willpower, not comfort. Yet the reality was stark. Units deployed to remote islands often withered before the enemy fired a shot, their fighting power sapped by starvation. Some garrisons, cut off by Allied naval blockades, were reduced to foraging jungle plants, stripping coconut palms, or boiling grass and tree bark in desperation. In New Guinea, entire regiments wasted away from malnutrition, and survivors recalled eating anything from snakes to insects just to stay alive. Against this backdrop, the food system of the United States military appeared not only efficient, but extravagant. When Japanese soldiers fell into captivity and saw what Americans considered standard rations, the shock was immediate and profound. The U.S. military recognized early in the war that food was not only fuel, but also a weapon of morale. A soldier who ate well, fought longer, thought more clearly, and retained loyalty to the cause. This philosophy drove the creation of multiple ration types, the C ration, the K ration, the 10-in-1 group ration, and even specialized packs for paratroopers or jungle warfare. Each contained carefully measured calories, proteins, fats, and vitamins. To the Japanese prisoner, the variety was staggering. A single K ration meal might include canned processed meat or cheese spread, biscuits, powdered drink mix, a chocolate bar, chewing gum, and cigarettes. Even this small, portable ration delivered more nutrition than what many Japanese soldiers ate in an entire day. When prisoners were shown American C rations, the impression was even greater. Cans of meat and beans, spaghetti with meatballs, hash with potatoes, and fruit cocktail were handed out as though ordinary. To men accustomed to scraping mold off a few grains of rice, this seemed like banquet food. The presence of meat was particularly striking. In Japan, meat consumption was limited even in civilian life, and for soldiers in the field it was practically absent. A tin of beef stew or corned beef was not just food, it was a symbol of another world. Bread also carried symbolic weight. The Japanese diet was almost entirely rice-based, and bread was considered foreign. Yet American soldiers ate loaves, rolls, and crackers casually as a daily staple. Prisoners encountered white bread soft and fluffy, something many had never tasted in their lives. Alongside bread came spreads like peanut butter or jam, items utterly alien to the Japanese palate. Sweets deepened the contrast. American rations included chocolate bars, candy, and chewing gum, not as rare treats, but as standard issue. For Japanese troops, sugar was scarce, sometimes rationed even on the home front. A piece of chocolate in a ration box conveyed a sense of abundance that felt surreal. Coffee was another revelation. Japanese soldiers sometimes received weak tea if supply permitted, but coffee was virtually unknown in their army. Yet here were packets of instant coffee included in almost every ration, along with sugar and powdered milk. To a captured soldier, the smell of brewed coffee carried connotations of comfort, warmth, and civilization, far removed from the harsh jungle reality they had known. Even the packaging made an impression. American rations came neatly sealed in cans, boxes, or waxed wrappers, easy to transport, resistant to spoilage. Japanese rations, when issued, often arrived in flimsy cloth bags or wrapped in paper that quickly deteriorated in the humid Pacific climate. To see food survive months of storage and still taste fresh reinforced the idea of American technological superiority. Beyond the physical contents, the sheer scale of portions amazed the prisoners. Where they were used to eking out a small ball of rice for an entire meal, American soldiers threw away leftovers they considered unappetizing or excessive. For the Japanese, the act of discarding food bordered on incomprehensible. They had been trained to treat every grain of rice as sacred, never to waste a single bite. Watching Americans casually toss aside uneaten bread or half a can of beans underscored the gulf between the two nations' material resources. The experience forced many Japanese prisoners to reassess their assumptions about the enemy. Before capture, propaganda had painted Americans as soft, decadent, and undisciplined. Yet, if an army that ate like this could still fight with such effectiveness, then clearly there was a deeper strength at work. Food, which had once symbolized national resilience through frugality, now became proof of Japan's vulnerability and America's industrial might. The contrast was so sharp that some prisoners initially suspected trickery. They wondered if these generous rations were staged for show, meant to deceive them into thinking America was stronger than it really was. But as days passed in captivity and the meals continued, the reality sank in. This was normal for American soldiers. This was the baseline of their war effort, for men who had starved in the jungle, who had eaten roots and boiled grass to stay alive. The discovery of such abundance left an unforgettable mark. The shock was not only physical, but psychological. Food revealed the staggering imbalance between the two nations. On one side, soldiers reduced to hunger, their bodies weakened, their morale eroded by scarcity. On the other, soldiers nourished by canned meat, bread, sweets, and coffee, their fighting capacity reinforced by surplus. To the Japanese prisoners, the American ration was not just a meal. It was a message. It told them, without words, that they had been fighting an enemy whose resources were vast, whose capacity to supply and sustain its forces was beyond anything Japan could match. That realization was as nourishing as the food itself, but also as heavy as the weight of defeat. For the Japanese prisoners of war, the American rations were not merely food. They were symbols, tangible proof of an economic and cultural reality far beyond anything they had imagined while fighting in the jungles and islands of the Pacific. Each item that appeared on the mess table or was handed out in a ration pack carried meaning that extended far beyond taste or nutrition. For men accustomed to scarcity, every can, every packet, every bar of chocolate became a sign of wealth, prosperity, and the immense industrial capacity of the United States. The most striking element was meat. In Japan during the 1930s and 1940s, meat consumption was limited even among civilians. The island nation lacked the vast pastures of the United States, and livestock production never approached American levels. Fish and rice dominated the Japanese diet, with small portions of pork or chicken appearing occasionally. For soldiers in the field, meat was a rarity. A few dried fish, a scrap of preserved pork, or a little canned sardine represented the maximum protein most men could expect. When they entered American captivity and encountered canned beef stew, corned beef hash, Spam, ham, or sausages distributed as though ordinary, it felt to them as though they had stepped into another world. Meat was not just food. It was power, vitality, and luxury. The richness of the taste, the fullness it provided, and the sheer portion sizes were unlike anything they had received in their own army. To eat beef until full was something many Japanese soldiers had never experienced, even before the war. Now it was provided casually, in metal tins stamped by American factories, and given out to prisoners who had been their enemies only weeks before. Bread added another dimension. For Japanese culture, rice was not just sustenance, but identity. Bread was foreign, alien, associated with Western habits. Before the war, bread was consumed in limited amounts in cities, but most rural Japanese had little contact with it. On the battlefield, bread was absent altogether. The sight of American soldiers eating soft white loaves, crackers, or biscuits every day underscored the difference. Bread in American rations was not exotic, but commonplace. Prisoners recalled with amazement the texture of sliced bread, the availability of crackers sealed in waxed packages, and the novelty of spreads such as peanut butter or fruit jam. To them, each slice of bread represented an abundance of wheat fields stretching across the American Midwest, an agricultural empire capable of feeding not only its population, but armies overseas. Bread became a symbol of industrial farming, mechanized harvesting, and a system of transport that could move grain across oceans and deliver it intact to men in remote outposts. Sweets deepened this sense of contrast. Sugar was scarce in wartime Japan, rationed at home and almost absent on the front lines. A Japanese soldier might go months without tasting anything sweet. Children on the home front considered a piece of candy a precious treasure. In captivity, American rations suddenly placed chocolate bars, candy drops, and chewing gum into the hands of men who had been starved of sugar for years. The psychological effect was enormous. Chocolate was not just a food, but a symbol of indulgence, a product of surplus. To unwrap a bar of Hershey's chocolate or a handful of hard candy was to confront a reality of plenty that Japan could not match. Even chewing gum, chewed absent-mindedly by American soldiers, became a mark of affluence. The idea that a product could exist solely for flavor and pleasure, with no nutritional necessity, was astounding to men who had survived on rice gruel and bitter vegetables. Coffee completed the picture. In Japanese military life, tea was sometimes distributed, but coffee was rare, expensive, and not culturally ingrained. Yet for American soldiers, instant coffee packets were routine, slipped into nearly every ration box alongside sugar and powdered milk. For Japanese prisoners, the smell of freshly brewed coffee was intoxicating. It conveyed comfort, warmth, and a kind of civilian normality that contrasted sharply with their own experiences of war. Drinking coffee in captivity felt like a window into a culture of leisure, of everyday abundance. The fact that such a beverage could be standardized, powdered, and issued universally to troops highlighted the scale of American industrial ingenuity. Beyond individual products, the entire system of American rations spoke to prosperity. Every can, every wrapper, every packet testified to a nation that could devote factories, ships, and railroads not only to weapons, but also to food. Japanese prisoners quickly understood that the logistical ability to provide soldiers with fresh-tasting meat, bread, sweets, and coffee thousands of miles from home reflected a kind of power that was invisible on the battlefield, but decisive in the war. Food became a language, communicating American prosperity without words. Prisoners compared their own experiences of eating half-rotten rice or foraging jungle roots with the sight of Americans distributing tins of fruit cocktail or cans of pork and beans. The gap was so wide it seemed unbridgeable. The American ability to provide variety, to ensure calories, to deliver vitamins and comfort foods alike, revealed a surplus of resources unimaginable in Japan's tightly rationed wartime economy. Even the act of packaging carried symbolic meaning. Japanese rations, when they arrived, were wrapped in paper or stuffed in cloth bags, vulnerable to moisture and spoilage. American rations were sealed in durable tins, vacuum-packed, or preserved in waxed cartons that withstood tropical heat and rain. The neatness of the packaging, the labels, the standardized appearance all suggested a mechanized system operating on a scale the Japanese had never seen. To the prisoners, every detail reinforced the impression of a wealthy society with immense productive power. The abundance of food also conveyed social messages. In Japanese military ideology, hardship was a virtue and deprivation was proof of loyalty. Soldiers were trained to see hunger as an inevitable part of service. By contrast, American rations reflected a philosophy that valued the well-being of the individual soldier. Comfort foods like chocolate or coffee were not indulgences in the American system. They were considered necessary to maintain morale. This difference struck Japanese prisoners deeply. They saw that American prosperity extended beyond economics into values, suggesting that a soldier was not merely expendable, but worth nourishing and sustaining. The shock of this realization came through everyday encounters. A prisoner, watching an American soldier casually eat canned peaches, might think not only of the sweetness of the fruit, but also of the orchards, canneries, and distribution systems behind it. A stick of chewing gum symbolized factories running without shortages, sugar fields in abundance, ships crossing oceans unimpeded. A slice of bread represented the grain elevators of Kansas, the rail networks of America, the bakeries of Chicago. Each product was a window into a larger world of prosperity, industrial scale, and agricultural might. The symbolism was amplified by the fact that Americans sometimes treated food casually, even wastefully. Japanese prisoners were astonished to see soldiers discard half-finished rations, throw away uneaten bread, or leave coffee untouched. For men trained to value every grain of rice, this casual attitude was unthinkable. It reinforced the impression that America possessed such wealth that it could afford to waste what Japan treasured. That waste itself became a symbol of prosperity. At the same time, American food carried a cultural symbolism that was not lost on the prisoners. Chocolate, coffee, and bread were not just products of industrial abundance, they were markers of Western identity, tied to a culture of consumer goods and comfort. For Japanese soldiers raised on austerity and self-denial, these items embodied a lifestyle that seemed both foreign and enviable. They represented a world in which the state provided not only weapons, but also pleasures, where even in war, the individual soldier could expect variety, taste, and satisfaction. This cultural symbolism merged with the economic symbolism to produce a powerful psychological impact. Food became a metaphor for America itself, modern, abundant, technologically advanced, and oriented toward the comfort of its people. In contrast, Japan appeared to its own soldiers as austere, resource-strapped, and reliant on sacrifice. The difference was not simply material. It was ideological. The American soldier fought with the confidence of someone who knew his needs would be met. The Japanese soldier fought with the resignation of someone who expected hunger as part of duty. For the prisoners, the difference between eating canned beef stew and surviving on rice gruel encapsulated the larger difference between the two nations. As the war progressed, the symbolism of American rations grew even stronger. Prisoners recognized that food was not isolated from the larger war effort, but integrated into it. The ability to produce meat, bread, sweets, and coffee in such quantities and transport them across oceans was inseparable from the ability to produce aircraft carriers, bombers, and tanks. The rations symbolized not only prosperity, but the industrial foundation of victory. The Japanese prisoners could not ignore the implication. If America could feed its soldiers like this, it could also outproduce Japan in every other category of war. For many, the memory of American food remained vivid long after captivity. They recalled the taste of chocolate, the aroma of coffee, the feeling of fullness after meat, as experiences that symbolized not only personal relief, but also the defeat of their nation. These foods, once luxuries or unknowns, became markers of a civilization that had overwhelmed them. They were not only impressed by the abundance, but humbled by what it represented. The symbolism of American rations went beyond the battlefield. It revealed to Japanese prisoners the existence of an economic and social order that valued comfort, variety, and abundance even in war. It showed them that their enemy was not simply another army, but the embodiment of a prosperous industrial society whose resources were beyond measure. Meat, bread, sweets, and coffee were the messengers of that reality. For men who had lived through scarcity, they were proof that the world was larger, richer, and more powerful than they had been taught to believe. In every bite, they tasted not just food, but the power of a nation that had redefined their understanding of war and prosperity. For Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific theater, captivity was initially associated with dread, humiliation, and fear. From the earliest days of their training, they had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a fate worse than death. The Imperial Japanese Army's code of honor demanded that soldiers fight to the end, and propaganda assured them that capture by Americans or British meant torture, degradation, and eventual death. Many expected starvation or execution the moment they laid down their arms, yet the reality they encountered was profoundly different. Instead of deliberate cruelty, they were met with food that was plentiful, varied, and nourishing. This unexpected dimension of captivity became one of the most powerful forces in reshaping their perceptions of the enemy. For men who had marched on empty stomachs, who had survived on rice gruel and jungle roots, the shock of eating American rations in a prisoner of war camp cannot be overstated. The first meal often broke through years of conditioning. Where they had expected brutality, they found meat and bread. Where they feared punishment, they received coffee, fruit, or chocolate. Food became the first bridge between captor and captive, softening hostility and replacing terror with bewilderment. The experience of eating well in captivity carried psychological weight. It forced the prisoners to reconsider the image of the United States painted by wartime propaganda. Instead of a decadent, cruel enemy, they encountered an adversary that fed them more generously than their own army ever had. Each meal contradicted the narratives they had internalized, and slowly, trust began to grow where only fear had existed. Nutrition did more than fill stomachs. It reshaped morale. Malnutrition had eroded Japanese soldiers' strength and clarity of thought during combat. In captivity, proper meals restored physical vitality. As bodies recovered, so did minds. The return of energy allowed prisoners to reflect, to reassess, and to compare. They realized that the Americans, far from despising them, were treating them with a baseline of humanity that their own officers often denied them. This recognition became a turning point. In many camps, Japanese prisoners even confessed astonishment that American guards ate essentially the same food they were given. This equality stood in stark contrast to their own military hierarchy, where officers routinely received better meals while enlisted men survived on scraps. The simple fact of shared rations symbolized a different social order, one where common soldiers had dignity and value. Food thus became an instrument of influence. It subtly undermined the rigid indoctrination of the Japanese military. With each day of balanced meals, prisoners experienced firsthand the difference between two systems, one that glorified suffering and another that invested in nourishment. They could not help but compare the indifference of their superiors to the unexpected generosity of their captors. Over time, this comparison eroded hostility and sowed seeds of respect, even admiration. The impact extended beyond physical sustenance. For many prisoners, food provided emotional relief. The sweetness of chocolate or the warmth of coffee evoked sensations they had long forgotten: comfort, safety, normality. These emotions, linked to the food itself, created associations between the act of eating and the identity of the Americans. To prisoners, it seemed their enemies were not simply warriors, but providers of a standard of living far higher than what they had known at home. This sense of prosperity and security contrasted so sharply with the hunger and deprivation of their own experiences that it altered their worldview. Some began to imagine what life might be like in such a society, where abundance was taken for granted. The influence of food on perception also had collective dimensions. As word spread among prisoners about the rations provided, rumors of American wealth and generosity circulated. Stories of canned peaches, chocolate bars, or bread loaves became camp legends, reinforcing a narrative of America as a land of plenty. This communal reinforcement amplified the psychological effect, turning individual astonishment into group consensus. Even those who resisted American influence found it difficult to deny the evidence on their plates. The transformation did not mean prisoners abandoned loyalty to Japan, but it introduced complexity. They began to hold two truths simultaneously: devotion to their homeland and recognition of the enemy's prosperity and humanity. This dual awareness created space for reflection, doubt, and eventually a reevaluation of the values they had been taught. In some cases, the change in perception had lasting consequences. Former prisoners later recalled captivity not only as survival, but as an awakening to a different world. The memory of food remained vivid decades later, cited as proof of the contrast between Japan's wartime austerity and America's wealth. Some even credited their survival to the nutritional generosity of their captors, acknowledging that without it, they would not have lived to see the end of the war. This gratitude coexisted with shame, but it left an imprint. The effect of nutrition also shaped relationships within the camps. Meals became moments of negotiation, exchange, and even cross-cultural contact. Guards and prisoners occasionally shared food, creating fleeting bonds across the divide of war. A cup of coffee handed to a prisoner could dissolve suspicion more effectively than words. A piece of chocolate offered casually could create a memory more enduring than a lecture. Food humanized both sides, reducing the distance between enemy and captive. For the Americans, providing adequate food to prisoners was partly a matter of policy, but it also became a form of soft power. By feeding their captives well, they demonstrated the reach of their resources and the strength of their values. They turned meals into quiet propaganda, showing that the United States was not only strong militarily, but also generous materially. For the Japanese prisoners, the experience was a lesson in contrasts. Their own army had glorified sacrifice, but failed to supply basic nourishment. Their captors, by contrast, displayed both power and compassion through food. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Even the waste of food reinforced the message. Prisoners were astonished to see Americans discard leftovers without concern. What seemed like carelessness to them was, in fact, another signal of abundance. It told them that America possessed such wealth that it could afford to waste what they themselves treated as sacred. This perception, however painful, underscored the imbalance between the two nations and gave prisoners a new understanding of why their own country was losing the war. Over time, food softened resentment and eased the trauma of captivity. It did not erase the humiliation of defeat, but it provided daily reminders that life continued, that survival was possible, and that the enemy was not as monstrous as propaganda had claimed. For many prisoners, these small realizations accumulated into a quiet transformation. They entered captivity fearing torment, but left it with a grudging respect for the society that had captured them. In hindsight, historians have recognized the power of nutrition in prisoner-of-war experiences. While much attention is paid to battles, strategies, and weapons, the food served in captivity played a decisive role in shaping perceptions and memories. For the Japanese prisoners, it was not only a matter of survival, but a revelation about the world beyond Japan. Each can of meat, each slice of bread, each bar of chocolate told them that their captors came from a nation fundamentally different from their own. The influence of food on perception extended beyond individuals to the collective memory of post-war Japan. As former prisoners returned home and shared their stories, they spread tales of American abundance. These stories contributed, in subtle ways, to the post-war fascination with American culture and consumer goods. The taste of chocolate in a prison camp foreshadowed the popularity of candy, coffee, and bread in Japan's Reconstruction era. What began as survival rations ended up shaping cultural currents long after the war had ended. Ultimately, the nourishment provided in captivity altered not only bodies but also minds. It transformed fear into astonishment, hostility into curiosity, and despair into reflection. It redefined the enemy not as a barbarian, but as a society of extraordinary wealth and capability. The memory of that transformation endured, embedded in the recollections of those who lived it, carried into the post-war world as a reminder of how something as simple as food could change perceptions across the deepest divides of war. And so, when we look back at the experiences of Japanese prisoners, we see that nutrition was not only sustenance, it was a force of diplomacy, a weapon of influence, and a messenger of prosperity. It told stories without words, reshaped identities without lectures, and built unexpected bridges between enemies. For the men who lived through it, the meals in captivity became some of the most powerful symbols of a war that was fought not only with guns and planes, but also with bread, meat, sweets, and coffee. They remind us that sometimes the most profound transformations in war come not from the battlefield, but from the dinner table. If you found this story about the hidden power of food in wartime as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss future explorations of history's untold sides. And tell me in the comments, if you were a prisoner of war, which food item do you think would have shocked you the most? Canned meat, soft bread, chocolate, or coffee?